My dear brothers and sisters here at Holy Cross, we continue with our study on Paul's letter to the Romans. And we are now in chapter 4, verses 4 and 5. Before I go into the reading of these verses and going a little bit further into chapter 4, I want us to back up and remember what happened with chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. We hear Paul talking about Abraham. And he talks about Abraham really being the point at which God initiates a covenant with a certain group of people. Now, this is really important on a couple of levels. First of all, as we've said a couple of times now, the reason that Paul goes to Abraham and not to Moses or some of the prophets or any of that is that he's trying to get behind, or what we might say, on the other side of the law. And he wants to show that there was actually a covenant that God created with Abraham for all of Abraham's ancestors. And that it's really this starting point, this beginning point, that's of crucial understanding to Paul. So we want to remember, he's talking about Abraham and he's talking about faith righteousness because he wants to say, all that Abraham had to do was to say yes to God. And that circumcision, while it was important, was really not the beginning of the covenant. It was in some ways the physical sign and manifestation of the yes that Abraham gave to God. Now this brings us to an even more meta point, we might say, and that is that while Paul is certainly writing a very theologically heady work with the Romans, this work is not really a philosophical work in the sense that he's just writing about categories of salvation and justification and sanctification and works righteousness versus faith righteousness. That's actually secondary and tertiary to what's really at the heart of this. At the heart of this is that Jesus has come to Paul. And he said to Paul, why are you persecuting me? Why are you persecuting my followers? What's up about this, Paul? Why are you doing this to me? At that moment, Paul was knocked off his feet. He was blinded. He was stunned. And it's at that point that Paul's life is turned upside down. And what this means is that also Paul's understanding of the story of God's work here on earth has been turned upside down. Before Jesus came to Paul, Paul was a Pharisee, as Paul freely admits. I was a Pharisee, the first among of them all when it came to zealousy. That is to say, is that Paul now has to come to terms with not only Jesus and what it means to be a follower of Jesus, but what the story that leads to Jesus means. He's going to have to reinterpret these categories and these events in salvation history. So what that means is no longer can Abraham solely be the father in faith of just Jews. And no longer can the patriarchs just be about the Jews. And no longer can Moses and the prophets be just about the Jews. Yes, the Jews have a very important role to play in this story. Without them, there really is no story between Abraham and Jesus. And Paul knows that. But what Paul also knows is this: the story has to mean something to Gentiles. It can't just be a story about Jews for Jews, whether it be in praise of Jews or critical of Jews. In other words, everything that came before Jesus has to be meaningful for both Jews and Gentiles. If it isn't, then we've got a problem. It's almost as though Paul was prescient in looking into a crystal ball or a magic 8-ball about what might have been the first heresy or fight in the church, and that really being Gnosticism and the refutation of the Old Testament as really being of any value to Christians. It's almost as though he could see 50 years into the future when he was writing Romans and some of his other works. So when we are reading, especially chapter 3 and chapter 4 in Romans, we have to be mindful that what Paul is doing here is he's reinterpreting a story in light of his experience of what happened to him on the Damascus Road when Jesus came to him. When not only Jesus came to him, but Jesus questioned him, and Jesus blinded him, and ultimately Jesus opened his eyes to what God was doing in the world. So let's take a look at Romans 4 through 5. Now to one who works, wages are not reckoned as a gift, but as something due. But to one who without works trusts him who justifies the ungodly, such faith is reckoned as righteousness. Now, there is a subtle shift going on here for Paul. First of all, Paul is talking about righteousness in terms of not doing anything. Most of the time, when we talk about righteousness, we talk about, I did the right thing. I was right. You were wrong. I did the right thing. You did the wrong thing. Officer, don't arrest me. I'm in the right. Well, Paul is turning that notion of righteousness upside down. And he's basically saying, hey, look, you don't get to make yourself righteous. You can do nothing to make yourself righteous other than say to God, yes, God, I need you. Yes, God, I want you. Yes, God, without you, I cannot be righteous. The righteousness that Paul here is talking about is one that is rooted in God's yes for us. Now, funny enough, what Paul will ultimately wind up saying later in Romans is, if you want to know where that yes began, well, it began with Abraham in a certain way. Yes, Abraham said yes, and yes, God said yes to Abraham so that there would be a specific chosen people. And ultimately, that chosen people would give birth to all being able to say yes as God's chosen people. But Paul has a trick up his sleeve here in Romans. Ultimately, he's going to say the yes that God ultimately had for human beings was the yes at creation. The yes in which God breathes life into Adam. And the yes when God creates Eve out of Adam's rib. See, that creative act in which humans are made by God in the likeness and image of God is the great yes of God for humans. But we know what happens in that story with Adam and Eve. They say no to God. They get confused. They get afraid. They get shamed of their own body and their own wills and their own ability to want to run from God. And so it takes a while for humanity to come back and say yes to God. Now, God did not make humans so that humans would need to say yes. Humans have a choice, and they've had a choice from the very beginning. If there's no choice, then in Paul's understanding, there's really no righteousness. Yes, it might be glorious to be an angel, but there's no yes. That's the beauty of being human. We can choose to say yes or no to God. We can say yes or no to each and every person that we love and that loves us. And what Paul is saying here is we've got a love affair. A love affair that starts in creation with God's yes for us. A love affair in which yes from God is what is offered time and again, even in the face of humanity's no. Now we'll continue that in our next video on Romans as we continue with chapter 4. God bless and amen.